Good evening, everyone. This is the 16th of November 2017 at about 8:30 p.m. on a Thursday, and I want to talk to you about why we need to privatize all schools in India, all government schools, and move towards for-profit school education, where the government gets out of education completely and only supports the poor where it is needed. And that's going to completely change the entire quality and outcomes of the education system from a really poor one that we have today to the world's best. We know that India's educational status is extremely dismal, and it is not something we need anyone to tell us. It is available. We can observe it on a daily basis in terms of the very poor skills that people have. And even, for example, recently I was reading this article by Mihir Sharma, who wrote in Bloomberg on the 15th of November, that is yesterday, that Indian skills don't match up. Consider the Make in India program. With its growing population, India has plenty of workers, yet investors commonly complain that they can't find employees with suitable skills and abilities. Various efforts by government to create skilling programs have fallen far short of targets. So far short, in fact, that it's recently abandoned the targets altogether. And I think that's all fine as a statement of the problem. But the tragedy for India is that people like Mihir Sharma, and I just don't want to talk about him in particular, but intellectuals in general, they are so confused about the issue. And for example, they talk about increasing the investment in education. I'm sorry, but that is not the issue here. It is completely a different issue of the incentives in place and how things work. And if you don't enter the details of how things work, you will come out with these superficial comments like Mihir Sharma's comment that we need to increase investment in education. So let's start from the very beginning. But before I do that, we just want to point out that the only real successful organizations in India, and I'm not counting the IITs here because IITs are really not as institutions, the world's greatest institutions, but they benefit from the fact that they attract the top Indian students. And when you get such high quality students, they will gobble up all the books and they will churn out the best information anyway on their own. They're themselves quite capable. So that's not really a kind of a model of good education. Good education we have seen, for example, with the NIIT. The NIIT is a private institution which has supported the entire development of the IT sector in India. And without it, I doubt whether we would have had such a big boost in the 1990s and early 2000s in terms of the number of people who are educated up to a particular high standard. This is all privately done, right? So that's a kind of vocational education where we were really good at. And the other one that I just want to mention is a great example of success is the for-profit, low-cost private school sector. That is, in which about nearly 30% of India's students attend. And these are the poorest of the poor. And these are the people who are attending for-profit, low-cost private schools. This is a great success story. And it's basically saying where the government has failed, then the private sector has managed to supply the necessary requirements. So we see these wonderful examples in the private sector in India. And before we proceed, I want to sort of mention probably the greatest, educational thinker in the world that I've come across, which is James Tooley. And I keep saying that again and again. I don't find anybody who's done so much due diligence about the genuine functioning of the education systems of the world as he has done. So he has gone into details historically, has looked at the actual data of what's happening around him, around the world today. And he's written this wonderful book, The Beautiful Tree, which you can read in probably about, just one sitting. It's such a great, wonderfully well-written book. So what is this book about? It's basically telling us that the private sector was managing quite happily and successfully the education of everybody at a very low cost prior to the government starting to dabble in this business. And he cites Macaulay and people of that sort in that period, roughly in the 1830s to the 1870s, who got involved in this paternalistic idea that the government has somehow to educate the children. They failed to observe that children were being educated by the parents to supply in response to the demand of the market. And he sort of demolishes so many myths in this book. And as you all know, I have a very high regard for Macaulay, who was one of the great reformers of England in the 19th century. And his work in the 1832 Reform Act, for example, or other work as a liberal, classical liberal, his writings are considered so good that people like Friedrich Hayek have had the greatest respect for his work and have recommended his writings, for example, the history of England and so on. So when I say about people like Macaulay and even potentially John Stuart Mill, who became paternalists and said no, but the government has to do something for these poor people, that's I think where they went wrong, and they needed to do some more research, and that's the beauty of James Tooley, that he actually did the research, and he has demolished many myths, and I've talked about these myths on my blog, and I'm going to summarize them here. The most common myth that we come across is that the poor parents really don't care for their children, children's education. So they sort of we get examples of people saying, they put them into this mandatory labor, almost like a slave labor, where they get children to work at a young age and exploit the children. Really, they don't really care for their education. But the reality has always been different from what has been touted, and I've been writing about this for quite some time. And what he found is that actually it is these poor parents. In fact, my doctoral thesis, my dissertation thesis, is all about saying how parents respond to the actual markets. So if the markets are growing and there's an expectation that education is going to help their children succeed, they will then put more money into the children's education, which also means they will have fewer children, which is exactly what's happened in India. And he found that the fees charged by the low-cost private schools were actually affordable by these parents, these poor parents. And he found that parents valued education very highly and would scrimp and save to ensure that their children got the best education they could afford. And we're talking here of the really poor children, poor parents. So, when this is the greatest myth that we find among the intellectual class in India and probably in the world, that the parents of the poor children, the parents who are poor will not really care about their children's education. It's a total myth. Now, the second myth that we have is that poor parents really can't pay for their children's education. And that's a huge myth as well, because we see the facts as they occur today. And across the world, this is not just India. It's in Africa, it's in China. It's also, wherever the government has failed to do something, which, by the way, the government should not have started in the first place. So he found that many poor parents can pay for all their children's schooling without any government assistance. Okay. This is what James Tooley found. And he writes in his book that we are missing an obvious conclusion, that if you are to reach the education for all target of universal quality primary education by 2015, surely we should be looking to the private sector to play a significant role, given the clear importance of its role already. And in fact, the unique phenomena of the United Nations organizations and government bureaucracies is that they oppose the involvement of the private sector in education. They have completely failed, and they are not willing to let the private sector come in, even though there is such conclusive evidence that the private sector was the one that was successfully delivering education till the 1830s and 1870s, depending on India, or when you look at India or England, depending on the context. But prior to that, there was some excellent education being imparted, and in fact there was a fantastic growth in schools, and we'll come to that in a minute. And that's all happening in the private sector. And then the government comes in, dampens education, and totally fails in the case of countries like India. And then we are saying we don't want to involve the private sector. Why? What's the problem? And James Tooley says that the poor have found a silver bullet. They send their children to a private school that is accountable, and the main thing to them is the accountability. The school is accountable to them because they are paying the fees. So the parents can pay. They pay. They scrimp and save for these little, for the small fees that these low-cost schools charge. The other myth is that the government schools are the best that we can provide. Actually, in all cases, and this is a universal phenomena, including in countries like Australia, the chain of accountability in government schools is really weak. Teachers have permanent jobs with salaries and promotions that are largely unrelated to performance, and the poor are therefore very highly disillusioned with government schools. This is true, I suppose, all over the world. Really, there are very few government schools where people can actually credibly say that they are good schools, and this is including the best schools in the West. So for the poor particularly, they don't exist in most cases. The teachers don't come, and I won't go into details because I've been Secretary of Education of Assam, and I've seen the kind of chaos that happens, and we know we don't need to go into details of how the government has totally failed. But the reason this is a general point, that schools will always fail. Government schools will fail because the accountability mechanisms simply don't exist. Now, there are a few cases, Singapore, etc., where they do have some decent accountability mechanisms. But, Singapore is a different country altogether in terms of the way they apply the most stringent economic principles from top to bottom. I don't know when India will be probably ready for such kind of harsh discipline of economics that applies to the government sector in Singapore. The other myth is that the government played a great role in educating children in Britain. This myth has somehow spread across the so-called educated world. Apparently, without the government, these children would not have succeeded. Well, actually, Tooley found that there was a huge growth of private school enrollment in England in response to the changing demand for labor before the state got involved. The government got involved from around 1870. In fact, after the government got involved, this growth dramatically slowed down. So what we see here is that the actual facts, which are completely contrary to what people talk about, are that the government actually damaged British education as well, leave alone the education of India, which of course was completely messed up because of the government's involvement. The final myth that I want to talk about today is the biggest of all myths, that education should not operate on a for-profit basis. And I think that is one of the best things that you can think about, in terms of James Tooley's work. Because what he's saying is that these low-cost schools, which are always for-profit schools, they actually operate like businesses. They are dependent on fees to survive, and they are directly accountable to parents' needs. And he's gone and studied them personally in Hyderabad and many parts of the world, and seen how hard the principals and teachers work, even if they are not so-called qualified. But we're talking primary school here. They don't need to be really having the big B.Ed degrees. They need to be decent at their own subject, and they need to deliver the kind of things that parents expect. The other one is that they don't have the very high quality infrastructure that government schools require, which is one of the biggest blunders. When the government got involved, they set up these high standards for infrastructure. Really, you don't need infrastructure. You need good teachers, and you need local availability of these schools. And that's exactly what was happening in the world, across the world, till the government started stepping in and completely sucked out the lifeblood of education in these countries, particularly in a country like India, where it's so vast that you really need to have local initiative. And we are not talking for profit in a very large sense here. We're talking very nominal profits here. These people are not becoming multimillionaires. They're running one school, okay? These for-profit principals running one school, starting from 20 children, maybe becoming 1,000, 2,000 children. That's what they're doing. And they're doing it in a very focused manner, and they're doing to the best of their ability. And there are some excellent examples in the slums and in the very backward, dense areas of cities like Hyderabad. So what is the point we have managed to sort of get out here? Before we go into the details of the role of government, one of the most important parts of things that we need to do in education is to demolish the myths and the kind of misconceptions that are rampant in this sector. And you find teachers unions, you find the various kind of leftists and various communists or whatever. They all demand the role of government in education just because they have asserted that the government is the only party that will do these things, and parents are so stupid they will not educate their children. They can't even afford it, and for profit is a really bad idea. Education is such an important thing. We can't have for profit. It should not be run like a business. Everything they say is 100% wrong. Now please pay attention to what I said so far in the first 15 minutes. If you have understood these first 15 minutes, the rest will flow. Please understand that everything you have been told so far about education is false, is wrong. And if you study James Tooley's book, which he has given so much evidence, you will soon realize that how great a scientist he is, and he has opened our eyes of the world. I really wish people they understand the science behind Tooley's work. Now, I've been talking about these kind of policies for longer than I have read Tooley's work, but the fact that Tooley actually studied this and proved it is one of the most phenomenal things that has happened to the education sector. And just by one man and his work, he's like a Charles Darwin of education, I would say. And he has therefore opened the eyes of the whole world to the fact that you don't need government to do education. Parents will do it on their own. All you need, and that's what I'll come to that in a minute, you may need to support the poor in some way, like you give them some extra money so that they can pay for higher fees and therefore get a better quality infrastructure. But really, you have no business to get involved as a government. Okay, let's now, when I talk about public policy, I always ask, what is the role of government? That is the very first question. Why should the government be involved in anything at all, for that matter? What's the problem we are trying to solve in the case of education? Well, we know for sure that it is not a problem for children of Ambani who are, that they are not attending school. Ambani is able to take care of his children himself, and so can all the upper middle class and the middle class. They can definitely and will take care of their own children, even as we have seen the poor. But let's say that, the issue was we have to solve some problem. Okay, is there a problem? Well, there's no problem as far as these sections of the community are concerned. And therefore, the idea of universal education by the government is pure nonsense. You can see that there's no real problem. Why should the government be doing things when there's no real problem? Okay, because government is always inefficient. We know that for sure. It is always costs double to do what the private sector would do. And in fact, it does the quality of the work it produces 1/4 of what the private sector would do. Therefore, it is about 8 times costlier, I would argue, than a comparative private sector organization. Now, but we also know that the poorest of the poor are also attending schools. The parents are sending them. So what is the real problem? The only problem that, as I mentioned a moment ago, the only argument we can make is that the government, as a society, we should support the poor as part of our social insurance program, which is what Swarna Bharat Party has in its manifesto. And as part of that program of equal opportunity, we are interested in getting high quality education, not just education for everybody, but high quality. And how do you get high quality education? You actually need to provide some extra infrastructure. We are not talking here of some unbelievably, large polo grounds or some such kind of thing. We're talking of decent, minimalistic infrastructure by which the poorest of the poor are able to access the kinds of things in the books and material and computers or whatever that children who are in the upper classes are able to also access. So that's the kind of missing link here. All we have shrunk the entire issue of government role to that little small thing of supporting the very poor. And we know how to support using vouchers, and I'll come to that later, but I probably won't talk much about vouchers given the shortage of time today. But I think the point I was saying here is that we have a targeted problem. The issue is very small. It is not a mega issue of educating everybody, right? So once we have come to that, then everything else becomes clear. So for example, we can see clearly that it is not the role of government to tell teachers what to teach. Now teachers, by the way, know what to teach. Is this one of the basic things, that's why they're teachers. They actually do a better job of teaching than the bureaucrats or anybody else who's sitting out there making big reports or whatever. These teachers know their subjects very well. They are supposed to teach. That's their job. They're professionals. Similarly, parents are able to decide what kind of education they want for their children. Like I know in India, the idea of medium of education being continuously debated, but really it's parents who should decide. And from all experience, we know that parents invariably choose English medium schools because they actually are responding to the labor market, and the labor market demand is clearly for as a higher wages for children who are fluent in English. And of course, the local language is important, and parents believe that's important, and so they will also get their children taught in the local language. And there are people who want Sanskrit to be taught and some other Urdu to be taught, and they also will come in, and those schools will respond. So we are not talking about a government role in syllabus or a government role in deciding what's to be taught. We are talking of an innovative model where parents will choose, teachers will choose. There'll be lots and lots of types of models of education. And this is where, various accrediting organizations will come up, different types of organizations will come up, and parents can choose, schools can choose, and this is their job. That's what they should do. So we have got the government out of practically everything in education. There's no need for government to run a school, no need to set a syllabus, no need to set the education, the medium of instruction, nothing. All it has to do is to make sure that the poorest are given some extra money. And so the first thing we learn from this discussion is that we need to get out of all government schools, we need to privatize all schools. Okay. And we also need to close down things like the CBSE, NCERT, and so on. This is exactly what Swarna Bharat Party's agenda is all about. Now, we are in the transitional phase where we don't have complete power to shut down all these things and to transform things. We will definitely be working on some more autonomous models and so on, which are available in different parts of the world to improve accountability of government schools. But really, that's not something I want to talk about today. Our main objective is to go from first principles, and first principles tell us that there is no role for government in actually delivering education. And so the final point I want to just cover up very quickly, because it's actually a lot of detail which I don't want to talk today about. It's all in the manifesto, in my book, Breaking Free of Nehru, etc. So when I talk about any policy, I think I mentioned this repeatedly. We must be aware of the quality of our machine of governance. So our machine of governance in India is our bureaucracy, is our political leadership, and that machine is really broken. And so, as I mentioned, without honest politicians and bureaucrats, none of the policy reforms that we are talking about will ever actually get done. So the privatization concept will be completely, a failure. People will be looting. These fellows will loot the entire system. They will buy up the land for themselves. They will do all sorts of stupid things. They will set up bad contracts, bad faith things. They will actually loot the country if you allow the current bureaucracy and the current politicians to privatize schools. So no, these are not the guys who should privatize schools. Privatization will happen only after the governance has been completely transformed, as I've been talking about repeatedly in other places. And that's also there in Breaking Free of Nehru in terms of the details of how the governance becomes honest. Without that and competent bureaucrats, you can't do it. So let us assume for a minute that we did manage to get these kind of honest and competent politicians. Then what do? Well, then again, it's a fairly detailed exercise, and I won't go into details here, but they're all many of the details are in the book Breaking Free of Nehru and in the Swarna Bharat Party's manifesto. What we would want to do is to start with a strategic plan, a complete plan on how to do these things, have the delegation of responsibilities, have the detailed contracts worked out, have the various auctions or whatever is necessary to be designed to be done in great detail, making sure that this is quality work. We are not talking about getting out of a thing in a manner that basically means there is thousands of crores of rupees of public wealth looted by the crooks of India. Now, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking of a very, very different approach. It will take a very different and systematic process during which no one is harmed, no teachers are adversely affected, and yet we get a completely different system. The plan would essentially take us from the current situation to the new situation where we have completely privatized all schools and ensured that the poorest children are funded through school vouchers. I trust you will spend some time to read the details which are there in the SBP manifesto. If you have any questions, please write to me at sabhlok@gmail.com and I'll try to address them. And I think that's all for now. This is a fairly longish initial discussion on education. And please remember that the key point here was that you should start by reading James Tooley and, of course, the SBP manifesto. All right. Thank you very much and good night.